This is a story from Ireland. It was written down a long time ago, probably around 1,000 years ago or more. But when it was written down, it was already very, very old. These stories have been told for a very long time, and this one is about a storyteller poet. Now, don't get me wrong, in those days, storyteller poets were very, very important people. Back then, people didn't live in houses with big windows. They lived in houses with thatch roofs, and the roofs went nearly down to the ground. And the walls were made of wattle and daubs, and there were no windows. Because what's the point of building windows if you haven't any glass to put in them? Of course, in a roundhouse, and even the kings lived in fancy roundhouses, it was quite dark. And if you live where there's just firelight, and there's no electricity for lights or television or PlayStations, well, there's only one thing you can do. You can tell stories. And so the storyteller poets were very, very important. But it was more than just telling stories of the old hero warriors and kings of Ireland. Oh no, it was much more than that. They could tell you stories about your ancestors. They could tell you about how long you'd lived in the area and your parents and grandparents and their grandparents before them. But it was more than that, because they could tell you how every river, how every lake, how every hill had got its name. But they were even more important than that, because in days when it was hard to travel and people weren't always as welcoming as they should be from other tribes, other tours, the storyteller poets with their staffs of office would travel from place to place, and they would tell stories as they went and pass on news, and they would bring news back, and they would bring new stories. So they were very, very important indeed. But it was even more than that, because the storyteller poets were the ones who knew all about the laws, how people should behave, what was right to do, what was not right to do. And if they liked what they saw, if you kept the laws and looked after the land, then they would tell great stories, praise stories about you, whether you were a king or a queen or a great warrior or a famous farmer or a bruggu who was the top farmer. Well, they would tell stories and praise you, and everyone would know how brilliant you were, and whatever fantastic stories they told about you, everyone would believe it. But if you failed to keep the laws, or if you did things that were bad for the land or the community in which you lived, then they would tell a different kind of story. They would warn you beforehand that if you didn't put your ways right, then they would make a blame poem, a satire about you. And if they did this, then red blotches would come up on your face, and everyone would laugh at you, and you wouldn't be important anymore. And that was the worst thing that you could happen, because in those days, your status was the most important thing about you. And if your status was high, you were important and you were welcome everywhere. But if your status dropped and people laughed at you, then you wouldn't be important and you wouldn't be invited anywhere, and that was a bad thing to do. And you know, they could do that even to the top warrior, to the top king, and if a king had red blotches come up on his face and wasn't important anymore, then he had to stop being king. So those storyteller poets were very, very important indeed, and maybe that's why we can still tell their stories today. But this story is about one of those storyteller poets. His name was Athirne. Now, Athirne was a great poet, a king's poet. Therefore, he was expected to be the best. And if you're a storyteller poet with all this power to tell other people what to do, then you have to be very, very careful to keep the laws yourself. And the trouble with Athirne was that he didn't do it. You see, Athirne was greedy. Athirne liked to keep things to himself. Oh, he had a fine house to live in, but instead of having an open door where everyone was welcome and the laws of hospitality were upheld, for it was always important that if somebody came to your house, you had to let them in, give them a meal, find them somewhere to sleep for the night. It was wrong to turn anybody away, and Athirne's door was always shut. And as for sharing food, there was no way that he'd share his food. No, Athirne was greedy, and he was particularly greedy for food. So if you knocked on Athirne's door and said, Athirne, can I share a meal with you? He'd have every excuse possible. Oh, no, you're welcome, but I hope you don't mind. I've got an infestation of fleas. No, I'll go somewhere else. Or, Athirne, can you find me a bed for the night? Oh, well, of course, you'd be more than welcome. Welcome as the flowers in May. But I hope you don't mind. I've got a terrible amount of rats here at the moment. I'm just trying to deal with them. No, I'll stay somewhere else. You see, you couldn't say no. But Athirne would say no by finding excuses. And that's not a good thing for a poet storyteller to do. Now, even though Athirne kept his door shut and he kept his food hidden, he was still not happy. He felt sure that one day he'd been expected to give away some of his goods or share some of his food. And he had a brilliant idea. Now, being a great storyteller poet, he was one of the people who stood on the borderlands between this world and the other world. Now, I better explain about that. Because back in those days, people believed that there were two worlds. Right next to each other, there was our world where the sun shines and the rain falls, and we know what it's like. It's the place we live, where we wake in the morning and we go to sleep at night, where we eat and so on, the ordinary world. And sometimes we think there's a bit of magic about it, but generally there isn't. And then there's the other world. And people said that this was right next to our own. Now, that world, the sun would shine every day, and it only rained there when it needed to. And the one thing you could be sure about that world was there was plenty of magic. And there you'd find great treasures, magical treasures, helmets of protection, swords of strength, whatever you needed. But the only trouble was that if they moved from that world into our world, they might change, become different, become dangerous. And maybe a small and friendly cat in the other world would become a horrible, ravening nightmare of a beast in our own. Now, that was dangerous enough. That was tricky enough. But there was one more problem moving between our world and the other world that lay so close together, was that you just might, get lost in time. You see, there was a problem about time, that our world and the other world were almost the same, but time ran differently there. And if you went across into the other world, you might come back again. You might even come back again the same shape or safely, or with a treasure or two. But you might not come back at the same time. You might come back last Friday, or 3 weeks' time, or 300 years' time, or Saturday fortnight. You wouldn't be able to tell, and getting lost in time was a terrible nuisance. So people tended to avoid travelling from one world to another. Now, there were lots of ways that you might get into that other world, deliberately or by mistake. You might go through a cave. You might get lost in a mist. You might find yourself in a dark forest. And sometimes, even if it snowed, you might find yourself in another world. Or you could cross over the sea to a hidden island. So many ways. Caves were very popular. And people were nervous about this, and they kept away, and they asked the storytellers, poets, to warn them about these dangerous places in between. But storyteller poets knew all about it. They knew how to get there safely, and sometimes, occasionally, they even knew how to get back. Now, Athirne, as I told you, was a great king's poet, and knew his way to the other world and back. He also knew how to stand on the border between the two, and where to find that border. Now, somewhere, not too far from where I live, there's a place called Longford, and near Longford there's a hill, and the hill is called Brileth. And Brileth, or Brileth today, is a very special hill. Now, you can climb to the top now and you'll see nothing there, but it's said by the storyteller poets that this was where the palace of a man called Mither was. Now, Mither's name means balance, middle. And he was just that. He lived between the two worlds. He was the judge, the magical, the other world person who kept the two worlds, our world and the other world, in balance. And he was on the border, and his tree-girt palace stood on the top of this hill and kept it safe and kept the balance right. But of course it was a dangerous place, and Athirne knew that Mither had 3 cranes outside his house at the top of Brileth. Well, these were called the 3 cranes of inhospitality. and I'll have to explain that. It means that they would warn that this was a dangerous place and they would tell you to go away. Now, I'm sure you know what a crane is. It's one of those birds where the legs seem to go backwards and it bends, the knees sort of bend backwards, so they're not actually their ankles, I think, I can't remember, but you know, those crooked legs. And then they're the ones with the big wide wings, the long pointed beaks, and they tend to stand on one leg and they will balance just like this and flap their wings and bob up and down, just like that. Those are cranes. Now, there used to be cranes in Ireland. There are still herons in Ireland, and the law texts tell that back then cranes and herons were good pets for ladies. Now, I don't think I know anybody who keeps a crane or a heron as a pet. There are plenty of people with cats and dogs, but not cranes or herons. But in those days it seems there were, but Mither's cranes were special. These were magical cranes. Athirne thought that if he stole these 3 cranes that would keep people away from Mither's house and warn them of the dangers, and if he brought them to his house, then he'd keep his own house safe. So very quietly and with a poet's stealth and the silence of the night, he went and he stole the 3 cranes of inhospitality and brought them back to his house. So now anybody visiting Athirne would have to pass the 3 cranes. The first stood there, it would flap its wings and bob up and down and go, "Keep walking!" Well, if you got past that, it got worse, because the second crane would flap its wings and stick out its beak and go, "Nothing for you here!" And if you got past that crane, the third would flap its wings and point its beak at you and snap and go, "Go away!" So how did that go? "Keep walking! Nothing for you here. Go away." Well, if you can get past that, you're a pretty strong warrior. And nobody did. And so everybody kept away from Athirne's house and he felt quite safe. But if you mess with magic, if you mess with the border of the 2 worlds, if you try and play a trick like that, something's going to happen to you. And something happened to Athirne. Now, Athirne was still not completely convinced that he could keep people away from his food. And so every night he would take a whole piece of roast pig, a whole loaf of bread and a bottle of wine down to a little place he knew near the river, where there was a sheltered place hidden among the hazels and the willow trees. And there he would sit and eat his food in secret. Now, one night as he was sitting there, just about to take a bite out of the piece of roast pig that he brought with him, a whole leg of roast pig, he saw a man coming towards him. Now, the man had a long cloak that seemed to shine almost as if it was in iridescent colours. He also had a golden band around his head and the giveaway golden sandals. Now, if you were wearing a band of gold around your head and golden sandals, then you were most likely from the other world, and any good storyteller poet will know this. Now, as a matter of fact, golden sandals have been found, dug up out of the ground by archaeologists, but they're not whole sandals. They'd be a bit clunky and hard to wear. They're like pieces of gold that strap onto the top of your shoes. And maybe it's something like that that this man was wearing. Athirne saw him coming, and he knew that he was dealing with someone from the border, from that other world. But he wasn't going to give up that easily. And so as the man approached, he looked at him and he stared him out. And the man said, "Athirne, now I've found you. Will you not share your meal with me?" "No," said Athirne, "go away." "Oh," said the man, in due a poet, "surely you know the laws of hospitality." "I do," said Athirne, "but I don't care. It's not your food. Go away." "You need to learn a lesson," said the man, and he held out his hand. And the pig, the piece of roast pig that was dripping in Athirne's hand, leapt straight out of his hand and into the stranger's hand, and the whole bottle of wine and the whole loaf of bread followed until all the food was in the stranger's hand. Athirne was absolutely furious. "How dare you treat me like this?" he said, "and I, a king's poet. Why, if you don't give me that food back at once, I shall lay a satire on you, and I'm warning you now." If you remember, the satire is the blame poem that will make blotches come up on your face. And everyone will laugh at you and you'll not be important anymore. Now, Athirne must have been mad to try this on a stranger from the other world. And true, the stranger laughed. "Oh, Athirne," he said, "you do need to learn a lesson." "I do not," said Athirne. "Tell me your name at once." Now, it was a rule. In those days, people didn't carry credit cards and they couldn't give information about themselves. So if somebody said, tell me your name, you had to give them your name. Otherwise, you were on a lost, and that was red blotch time. Well, the man turned to Athirne, he smiled, and he gave a whole list of names. Now, in the early Irish in which this tale was written, they're all 2 words. And if you try and translate them into English, and my friend Isolde has done this for me, she tells me that they're very, very strange. For instance, one of this group of 2 words translates to elope boat. Well, that makes no sense. Another one translates into sharp lard. Well, that doesn't make sense either. There's a whole list of them. Just strange groups of 2 words. None of the words have anything to do with each other. Now, I bet you could add some more. Let me think. Mouse scissors, or frog curtain. I don't think anybody's going to be called mouse scissors or frog curtain, and nobody was going to be called sharp lard or elope boat. But what Mither, for it was Mither, as I'm sure you've guessed, had done, was to hide his own true name in the middle of this list of nonsense words. Now, in the middle of it, he'd hidden 2 words, though they're not 2 words in modern Irish, in modern English rather, which mean what is owed is due. In other words, what you owe, you'll have to pay. Things have to balance. And that was Mither's name. It meant balance. But Athirne, he couldn't find Mither's name. He couldn't find it at all. And he certainly couldn't make a satire on a load of nonsense words. And so he couldn't make a satire at all. And as he couldn't make the satire that he threatened and promised to make, I'm afraid it bounced back on him. And it was red blotches came up on his face, and everybody laughed at him, or whether he learned his lesson and became a better poet, our story doesn't tell. But Mither, he took the cranes back to his place on Brilay. And you know, nobody's ever seen them again. And the cranes of hospitality come into no other story. So perhaps Mither took them back to the other world where they belong. And as for Athirne, well, maybe he learnt his lesson. But being a poet, being a storyteller, was a very important job back in those days. It was a very important thing to be. And you know, I think it still is. Another story before long.